Hi everyone, and welcome to this video going over lesson 27.1, circles on the coordinate plane. In this video, we are going to talk about graphing circles on the coordinate plane and how do we write the equation for a circle in order to graph it. So let's get started. In part A, it says, show that the points given in the diagram are on the circle by showing that the coordinates satisfy the equation given for the circle. So let's start with the point 0, -2. That is x and y, and I'm going to plug in those values into this equation to show that that equation graphs the circle we see here. So instead of x squared, I'm going to say 0 squared plus y, which is -2 squared, and we're going to see if this equals 4. Well, 0 squared is 0, -2 times -2 is +4, and 0 plus 4 does equal 4. And so that point is on the circle because it satisfies the equation. And now let's check this other point. So instead of x, I'm going to say 1 squared plus, instead of y, radical 3 squared. And we're going to see if this equals 4. 1 times 1 is 1. And when we square a square root, the square and the square root undo each other, leaving me with just 3. And 1 plus 3 is 4, which equals 4. And so that point is also on the circle because it satisfies the equation. Now let's start to see where this equation comes from. In part B, it says, consider the circle below, which has its center at the point 0, 0, and has a radius of 5 units. It says, use the distance formula to write an equation to show that the distance from xy to 0, 0 is 5. So remember, our distance formula is distance is equal to the square root of y2 minus y1 squared plus x2 minus x1 squared. And so our 2 points are xy and 0, 0. I'm going to let 0, 0 be our x1 and y1, and I'm going to let x and y be our x2 and y2. And then remember, they're telling us that the distance is 5, since we already know that the distance between those 2 points is 5 units, which means we can plug in 5 for d, since we already know that that's the distance. So 5 is equal to the square root of y2, which we said is y, minus y1, which is 0, squared, plus x2, which is just x, minus x1, which is 0, squared. Y minus 0 is just y, so I can rewrite this as y squared. And x minus 0 is just x, so I can rewrite this as x squared. And then in order to get rid of a square root, I can square both sides. 5 squared is 25, and then a square undoes a square root, leaving me with y squared plus x squared. And this would be the equation of a circle. And so here's what the equation of a circle tells us. The equation of a circle is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared is equal to r squared, where h and k come from the center of the circle, and r is the radius. Because look at the equation we just got. Since x and y are all by themselves, that tells us that 0 is being subtracted from them. So the center is 0, 0, which it is. We can see that from the picture. And our equation equals r squared. The square root of 25 is 5, and 5 is the radius of this circle. And so that's how we write the equation of a circle. We need to know the center and the radius. Let's practice writing the equation of a circle, knowing these 2 pieces of information. So I'm going to rewrite the general form of the equation of a circle. Since our center is 0, 0, that is what we are going to subtract from x and y. And our radius is 7, so this equals 7 squared. Now let's simplify. X minus 0 is just x, so I can rewrite this as x squared. Y minus 0 is just y, so we can write that as y squared. And 7 squared is 49. And so this would be the equation of a circle with a center at 0, 0 and a radius of 7. Let's try this again. Our center is 0, 2, so that means that I'm going to say x minus 0, since that's the x coordinate of the center, plus y minus 2 squared is equal to 10 squared. X minus 0 is just x. I'm going to leave the y minus 2 squared how it is, and 10 squared is 100. Let's try this one more time. Here my center is 9, negative 4, and a radius of radical 15. So I'm going to say x minus 9 squared plus y minus negative 4 squared is equal to radical 15 squared. Now let's simplify. I can't simplify x minus 9 squared at all, but I know that when I have two negatives right next to each other, that turns into a plus, so this will be y plus 4 squared. And a square undoes a square root. So if I'm squaring radical 15, this just becomes regular 15. Now what we're going to practice is, given an equation, can we identify the center and the radius? So let's make sure we understand some of the patterns we've already seen. We know that if in the parentheses there is a minus, that our center is actually positive. So for example, when we had x minus 9 in the parentheses, our center had an x coordinate of positive 9. Yet when we had a plus in the parentheses, like y plus 4, we had a negative as our coordinate for the center. So keep that in mind. Also make sure you know that what the equation equals is not the radius, but the radius squared. So in order to identify the radius, we are going to have to square root what the equation equals. And lastly, if there are no parentheses at all, like this x squared in b, that means that coordinate is 0, because the only reason why it became x by itself or y by itself is because we were subtracting 0. So let's keep these in mind as we identify the center and radius for ourselves. So in A, I am subtracting 2 from x, which means that 2 is the x coordinate of the center, and I'm adding 1 to y, which means that this would have been y minus negative 1, and so my y coordinate is negative 1. And so 2, negative 1 is the center, and in order to get the radius, we have to square root what the equation equals. So the square root of 9 is 3, and so 3 is the radius of the circle. Let's try one more. In B, since I'm adding to x, this must mean that I had x minus negative 3, and so the x coordinate is negative 3. And notice how there's no parentheses at all for y, which means the y coordinate must be 0, since y minus 0 is just y. And in order to get the radius, we have to square root what the equation equals. However, 10 is not a perfect square, so we are just going to leave our radius as the square root of 10. Let's move on to try something a little bit more challenging. In E, it says, consider the circle that has a diameter with endpoints negative 1, 4, and 9, negative 2. So if I draw a circle, a diameter has to go through the center, and it says the endpoints are negative 1, 4, and 9, negative 2. Determine the midpoint of the diameter. Remember, our midpoint formula is we are going to add the x's and divide by 2, and then add the y's and divide by 2. Because by finding the average of our x's and our y's, we will find the point that's in the middle of these two endpoints. So I am going to add negative 1 and 9 and divide by 2. and then add 4 and negative 2 and divide by 2. Negative 1 plus 9 is 8, and 4 plus negative 2 is 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. And so the midpoint is 4, 1. Now the question says, what information does this give you about the circle? Well, since those two endpoints were the endpoints of a diameter, we know that the middle of those two endpoints is actually the center of the circle. And so by finding the midpoint between the endpoints of a diameter, we find the center of the circle. And then at B, it says write the equation of the circle. So starting off, I can say x minus 4, since 4 is the x-coordinate of the center, plus y minus 1 squared, since 1 is the y-coordinate of the center. But in order to finish this off, we need the radius of the circle. In order to find the radius, all I need to do is find the distance from the center of the circle to one of the endpoints. And so I'm going to pick negative 1, 4. By finding the distance between those 2 points, I find the radius of the circle. So once again, the distance formula is y2 minus y1 squared plus x2 minus x1 squared. And I'm going to use the points negative 1, 4 and 4, 1. I'm going to say that this point is x1 and y1, and this point will be x2, y2. y2 is 1, and y1 is 4, so I have 1 minus 4 squared, plus x2 is 4, minus x1 is negative 1 squared. 1 minus 4 is negative 3, and when I have two negatives next to each other, it becomes a giant plus, so this will become 5 squared. Negative 3 squared is 9, and 5 squared is 25. 9 plus 25 is 34. And unfortunately, 34 is not a perfect square, so we are just going to leave it in the radical. And to complete the equation of my circle, I need to set it equal to the radius squared. But remember, if we ever square a square root, the square undoes the square root. So my final equation will be x minus 4 squared plus y minus 1 squared is equal to just 34. And that is how we write the equation of a circle. We need the center and the radius, and the form is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared is equal to the radius squared. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in class.